One lesser-known fact about the Vietnam draft is that, from 1965 to 1969, more American men were actually deferred for being nearsighted than for being conscientious objectors. The misconception is that the draft was just a random lottery that treated all young men equally. But in reality, it was a carefully layered system that funneled the poor, the undereducated, and, the dark-skinned straight into combat. The overlooked consequence is that the draft didn't just shape who fought in Vietnam, it actually reshaped American culture for a whole generation, creating this lasting distrust between working-class communities and the college-educated elite. For example, in 1966, 42% of men called up were from the lowest socioeconomic quintile, while only 12% came from the highest. So, let's start with an overlooked decision after World War II. The draft was deliberately designed to be fair by deferring college students. The assumption was that educated men would become officers or technical specialists, not infantry. What no one really anticipated was that by 1965, the Vietnam War would need so many riflemen that the deferment system stopped being a sorting mechanism and started being, a class filter. The human limit here is that draft boards were local, mostly white, mostly older, mostly conservative, and they decided, case by case, which young men from their town would go and which would stay. Muhammad Ali was drafted, refused induction, and was sentenced to 5 years in prison, though that conviction was later overturned. He never served a day. But the cost was his prime athletic years and, honestly, millions of dollars in legal fees. The dry observation is that if the draft had actually been truly random, the anti-war movement would have been much smaller. That kind of randomness would have hit every community equally, spreading the pain and spreading the dissent. For instance, even though California had about 10% of the U.S. population, it provided only 6% of drafted soldiers. Because the draft was not random, the anti-war movement was concentrated on elite campuses where, honestly, almost no one was being drafted. The people actually dying in Vietnam had no platform, no newspaper access, and no opportunity for congressional testimony. A 1973 study by the Congressional Research Service found that soldiers from families earning below the median income were 31% more likely to die in Vietnam than those earning above it. The draft reshaped culture because it forced a question that really no previous American war had asked. Why should this man go and that man stay? Next, let's connect this to later doctrine. The all-volunteer force created in 1973 was not a military reform. It was, in fact, a political solution to a cultural wound. Nixon understood that the draft was destroying support for any future war. If you want the public to tolerate a conflict, you simply cannot send their sons against their will. The all-volunteer force worked brilliantly for the military: better retention, higher skill, lower disciplinary problems. But it also created what sociologist Charles Moskos called the new mercenary gap. The gap did not disappear. It just stopped being visible to the wealthy who no longer knew anyone serving. In 1975, enlisted soldiers came from all income brackets relatively evenly. By 2005, the bottom 2 quintiles provided 58% of enlisted personnel. The dry observation about the end of the draft is that it solved the problem of campus protests by eliminating the students from the risk pool entirely. But the cultural chasm that the draft created between those who serve and those who are served by has only widened. In 1950, 80% of Congress had served in the military. In 2024, that number is 17%. The people who vote for war are not the people whose children go to war. That separation is the longest-lasting consequence of the Vietnam draft. That waiting room contains America's compact with its soldiers. The draft is gone. The debt remains. The draft did not end injustice. It just privatized it. Now the poor still serve. They just do so voluntarily. The lesson for today is that when a society separates risk from reward, the risk always flows downhill. The draft made that flow visible. The all-volunteer force made it invisible. Subscribe to War Machiner and share this if you value history that goes deeper.